I'm going to first start off talking about some challenges birds face. I always think it's really important to come back to the challenges birds are up against because, we do a lot of bird monitoring and we do it because of these challenges that we know they face. I'm going to follow that up with some bird monitoring importance and why it's important and some of the historical bird monitoring programs that are out there. And then I will move into talking about Project Moon, as Dennis mentioned, the monitoring of owls and nightjars project, and then follow that up with talking about 3 other projects. One I know that many of you are probably familiar with as the spring bird count. So I always have to put that plug in there. And then the Critical Trends Assessment Program, which I currently work for. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the Phillips track banding station. We all know that birds are basically declining. There was the big Rosenberg paper that came out saying that 1/3 of our birds are gone. The causes for those declines are, all over the board, from things like cats, which we know kill a lot of birds, window collisions, food availability. So we know that, around 96% of North American birds eat insects or feed insects to their young. And so having insect availability is really important for birds as well as other food sources. And things like pesticide use and poison and temperature changes can affect what foods are available for birds. And then things like habitat loss. So, in Illinois, we've lost most of our grassland habitat. I think there's like 0.02% of remnant prairie left in the state. So we've seen major landscape changes over the last 200 years. And also, many of the birds I'm going to talk about today are migratory birds. So these are birds that face challenges along their whole life cycle. And so they're having to find stopover habitat that's suitable. And then they're going to their wintering habitat. And, we don't always know what's going on, along those migratory routes and what's going on in their wintering habitat. So we want to start trying to connect these dots and seeing how we can better help with bird conservation through connecting dots and working with partners throughout North and South America. And then finally, climate change. We all know this is a huge one. And these are kind of all intermixed too. We're seeing a lot of phenological mismatches. So, things where, the plants are blooming earlier. And so it's affecting what caterpillars are available, for instance. And so when these, long distance migratory birds that come up and depend on these food sources to be there, if they're not there, well, that's a problem. National Audubon has also shown a change in latitude of the bird center of abundance. So we've known this is happening for a while, but they were able to actually do the stats and show it. So you can see this is based on over 300 bird species that they looked at from 1996 to 2013. And you can see birds are moving farther north. Their general populations are farther north now. And again, I think we're going to continue to see these things as climate change continues. To take this one step further, because I am going to be talking about nightjars today, is range movement due to climate change with the eastern whippoorwill. So Audubon actually is predicting that this bird will lose 81% of its range by 2050 if the temperature continues to rise. That's a bad thing. As you can see, based on the range map, this bird is migratory, and it's predicted that the only part of its range you'll still find it in breeding is like the southern part of Canada by 2050 if this continues. And we already know they're declining, so that's not good. As I mentioned, insects are in trouble. There was the big paper that came out from Europe and Germany, that big study that happened over there where they showed a 75% decline over 27 years in total insect flying biomass. And the sad thing about that is that was in 63 protected areas. And they were also able to correlate that data with a great decline in bird numbers over there as well. There was also a study in Denmark. It was a windscreen study. So basically cars would go out and they did 1,375 surveys over a 20-year time span. And the cars would drive these transects. And what they found, because they had 2 transects that were driven, were an 80% and 97% reduction in insects that they were finding on those windscreens. And they were able to actually correlate that with barn swallow declines as well. And then there was a Puerto Rico study too that was done, and a US and Mexico team actually found data from the 1970s that showed weight declines in insects and other arthropods that were collected. So this is interesting because we know that with slight temperature changes, even insects can't regulate their body temperature. So it can affect their reproduction. And if they can't reproduce, then, that food is not going to be available for all of these birds that depend on that food. Bird morphology is changing. So there was the Chicago study. Over 40 years, they assessed it was around 52 species of birds, mainly sparrows, warblers, and thrushes, that had died from window hits. And they took these morphological measurements. And what they found over time was that birds are now smaller. Their body size is smaller, and their wings are longer to compensate for those metabolic costs due to those smaller body sizes in those birds. And so, again, we're seeing all these changes. And going back to the whippoorwill too, they did a similar study in Canada where they looked at old museum specimens of birds of whippoorwills, and they compared them with more recent specimens of whippoorwills. And they also found that, these whippoorwills eat insects. And so insects that have higher nitrogen content are larger insects. Like larger moths will have more nitrogen than, say, a smaller moth. And what they found in these isotope analyses were that they're now taking in less nitrogen than they used to. So they're taking smaller meals, and they're not finding those larger meals that they have historically had available to them. I always like to throw this figure in because I think it's a good, visual of how our landscape has changed over time. So this dates back to 1820 and the changes in Illinois land cover over that time. And you can see the lime green there, that lovely big lime green over in the early 1820s. That was prairie, and it basically is, it's mostly all gone in Illinois. Whereas you now have, as we all know, corn and soybean everywhere across our landscape. So again, when you see something like this, it's going to affect lots of organisms along the way. There was a study, and maybe you guys maybe Jeff Walk talked from the Nature Conservancy, or even Mike Ward came and talked to you guys about this study, the Illinois Century of Change. It was a 100-year bird study. And back in the early 20th century, Stephen Forbes from the Natural History Survey tasked a couple grad students to walk across the north, central, and southern portions of Illinois and walk these bird transects to see what, birds they saw or heard at the time. And the study was repeated again in the 1950s by Dick and Jean Graber. And then it was repeated again at around 2006 by survey staff and university staff. And we took all these photos that the Grabers had taken from the 1950s, and they showed landscape, all these landscape photos at the time. And we took and we digitized them all, and we compared them with photos that from the exact same places that we took and digitized from 2006. And this is Flag Center from 1958, and this is up Northwest Illinois. And you can see, there's a lot of, different colored rectangles and squares, and just, the landscape isn't too, homogenized at this point. And then you can see it in 2007. And, it's changed a lot. So while there was farmland, back a long time ago, it hadn't changed to the capacity that it's changed in that last 50 years. So it's changed a lot. And again, this affects how organisms respond and ecosystems respond. Which brings me to why we monitor birds. Well, we mainly monitor them because we want to determine their population status. And if they're declining, if they're increasing, these are important things to know because they're essential for management of the species and conservation of the species. They're also really good indicators of environmental health. Birds are really easy to monitor, with over 10,000 species in the world And so many people that like birding, they provide, it's easy to do. And they're also sensitive to changes. And again, as I said, they're found all over the world. So we can go out and easily monitor birds and do it as, a huge group throughout the world. And so that's really nice that we're able to do that, because not all organisms are that easy to monitor. Also, finally, understanding how birds react to changes can also help us mitigate future ecosystem failures. There's been a lot of monitoring history, especially in Illinois. So these are just a few of the historical monitoring programs that I know of that I decided to list on here. We all know about, I think we all know about the Christmas bird count, which was started in the early 20th century by Audubon because, everyone was shooting birds prior to that. And so, he came out and said, well, let's do a bird count instead of shooting the birds. And so, the first Christmas bird count began, and it's still going on. And so that data has become really, really useful over time. Then I mentioned that Illinois Birds, A Century of Change book, that 100-year bird study. And I posted a picture of the book over there. And it's a really neat and interesting book. If you haven't read it or are interested in it, it is at the Illinois Natural History Survey. So if you're interested, it's a great book. There's waterfowl surveys that have been done for a really long time. As we all know about the breeding bird survey, those surveys started back in 1966. And so again, lots of useful data has come from those surveys. A breeding bird atlas, the last one we did in Illinois was 2004. And I know there are some folks that are really interested in another one of those being done soon, but it's just it takes a lot to organize something like that. So hopefully one of those can happen soon. It's just figuring out all the logistics of that. Again, there's a lot of programs. I don't have to talk about all these. There's MAPS programs. Those are monitoring avian productivity and survival. A lot of those are banding stations. And then things like the spring bird count, which I'll talk about in a while, because I have to put a plug in for the spring bird count. There's been a long-term monitoring of prothonotary warblers down in Southern Illinois for a very long time. And then, as I said, I'm planning on talking about some other programs today. And one is that critical trends assessment program that I work for, and then Project Moon, and then finally Phillips track banding station, which I'll talk about later too. But first, I'll get into nocturnal bird monitoring. That's a little screech owl that I pulled out of a box a few years ago that I banded. And as you can see, that owl was really thrilled with me at the time. But yes, it's they're pretty feisty little owls. The reason we started the nocturnal bird count Moon was because, most of these counts and these historical programs don't survey for birds that are out at night. And while things like the spring bird count, are starting, because there are so many people that now bird, I think there are starting to be more people that start earlier or bird a little longer on spring bird count day. So we do get some data, but it's not standardized so that we can actually get at what's really going on with these species. And if you look at these figures here, I always show these because they are figures based from breeding bird survey data looks like this, and spring bird count data looks like this. So we don't see any real trends with these nocturnal birds. And so we needed to figure out, well, what can we do to try to get at these population trends of the nocturnal birds? So we started Project Moon back in 2008, with the objectives being to track trends in abundance and distribution over broad scales. So we work with people throughout the Midwest and even the Northeast. So at the time that we put this program together, we had talked to people from Bird Studies Canada, people in the Northeast that had been doing this for a few years prior to us. We talked to the Nightjar Survey Network, the US Nightjar Survey Network, and some of the other Midwestern states. And we wanted to kind of be on the same page in terms of protocol and standardize so that we could all, collaborate and put our data together to look at it on a broader scale. Also, we want to investigate if they are declining, why these nocturnal birds are declining, what's going on. And then finally, just try to figure out how we can best help the birds that are declining, and possibly do some suitability models to see how we can do that. If you're not familiar with Moon and how the methods of what we do during a moon route, here you go. They're actually roadside point counts. So you just drive your car and you get out of your car at 10 different stops. Most routes are 10 stops. There are some routes in the state, due to just urbanization, that the routes, it's impossible to have a 10-stop route. That's mainly in the Northeast part of the state. But most of the routes are 10 stops, roughly at least a mile apart, to avoid recording the same bird twice at a different stop. And then volunteers get out of their car and they listen passively for 6 minutes, and they record anything they hear in 1-minute blocks. So if you hear 2 different barred owls in the same 1-minute block, you're going to record them on different lines, because those are 2 different birds you're hearing, but you're not going to record the same bird within that same 1-minute block 2 times. Just all you need to do is record it 1 time. We also give volunteers the option of using playback for screech owls and barn owls. I have the wrong alpha code. I just realized there for barn owls. They change the alpha codes for birds so often, it seems, these days. And then I realize I haven't updated mine. But these birds seem to respond well to playbacks if they're present. However, they can be harder to detect without using the playback, which is why we try to use playbacks for those 2 species. And finally, the surveys are run 2 times each year, in May and June usually, and it's based on the lunar cycle. And the reason we base that on the lunar cycle is primarily because nightjars are known to nest on the ground and actually time their chicks hatching to around 10 days before a full moon. So they're more active. They can see better, they can hunt for food better. And in general, most birds that hunt at night, obviously owls can use their ears to hunt as well, and do, but they're also use their eyes. And so being able to, on a clear, bright night, is going to help birds hunt a little better, and they're usually a little more active because of that. Here's an example of what our data sheet looks like. This is kind of cut in half, but it's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. We do record each stop, what the wind is, the sky is, and if there's noise, because there are some stops that are noisier than others, depending upon where you're at. And then we also, again, as I said, we write down the stop number. We write down the time that we make it to each stop. And then if there's a species that we hear, we just put the alpha code for that species. So it's pretty simple. And again, most routes take, if you don't use playback, they usually take about 2 hours to do. If you use playback, that adds a little time and can be anywhere from like 2.5 hours to 3 hours. But again, you're only doing it 2 times a year. So it's not too bad. Although I always try to tell volunteers that even if you don't get any data, it's still important and useful information to us. And that is the one thing about nocturnal bird counts, is it's not like a daytime count where you're usually guaranteed birds. It's very different in that sometimes you just hear crickets at night or frogs. But again, that's useful information. Here's a map of the moon routes in Illinois, and we took our routes and based them, all of our routes are random for the most part. There are a few that are not, but for the most part, they're random based on the forest land cover layer in Illinois. And we did this a little differently than some of the other states, because most states actually did theirs based on breeding bird survey routes. But we knew that if we did that in Illinois, that I probably wouldn't have any volunteers at all, because most of the routes would be in agricultural setting, and it wouldn't be useful data that we would be collecting at all. So again, like I said, we did these along forested habitat, or areas that were in along, at least potentially in forest habitat. And just here's another map showing where the routes are again. As you can see, the red ones are routes that we may not have volunteers for. And I say may not because I had a major computer crash like 3 months ago that I'm still recovering from, because silly me, I thought all my stuff was backed up, but apparently a few things weren't that were very important to me. So yes, that's caused me some extra time and work at this point, which is unfortunate. But anyhow, I'm working on that. I'm working out the kinks. But for the most part, this is pretty accurate. We monitor, as I said, owls and nightjars. And if you're thinking about owls, there's nearly 270 species in the world, and they're found almost everywhere except for Antarctica, I guess. But recently there was actually a barn owl apparently that they found on Antarctica, strangely enough. Around 68% of owls live in the southern hemisphere, and we have 32% that live in the northern hemisphere. So the majority of these owls actually are not even from, the northern part of the world here. And so I think that's quite interesting. But what I also think is interesting is that 75% of these birds like to be, are found in undisturbed forest. And so when you think about the landscape in Illinois, it is very disturbed and very fragmented. So you have to wonder how it affects owls in Illinois. We have 19 species in North America. There they all are, and they're lovely forms. I always like this because you can see all the different, all the differences between all the owls, and they all are very different. They may kind of look similar when you're trying to figure out what they are way up high in the tree, but when you see them like this, you can see lots of apparent differences between them. In Illinois, we have 5 species of nocturnal owls, and I don't have short-eared owl on here, even though we do. It's rare that someone gets a short-eared owl on a route, and that's mainly because of time of day that we're doing the routes. But it does happen occasionally. So I don't want you to think that they can't be included, because we do occasionally get one. But for the most part, we monitor for these 5 species. That being said, I know we get very few saw-whet owls. I think we've only ever had like 1 or 2, and that's in very far northern part of Illinois too, along our routes. But things like the barred owl, they seem to be everywhere around. It was a little over 100 years ago. These guys were not all over Illinois, and now they are. They've just exploded throughout the state. And then the barn owl, as most of us know, is threatened, although the DNR had the recovery program they put into place with all the nest boxes has done really well. And these birds really seem to be making quite the comeback in Illinois. And we just had a contact from Wisconsin recently, and they had their first barn owl up there. So they're pretty excited about that. So that's really great to hear too. Here is a map showing nightjar distribution throughout the world. So we have around 100 species of nightjar in the world, and they're split into 2 main subfamilies: the Caprimulginae, which has around 80 species. Those are like your whippoorwills and chuckwills, widows. And then Cordialinae. Those are your nighthawks. And there's only around 19 species in that family. If you don't know what a nightjar is, it's this small cryptic bird. And, the pictures on the right are all nightjars. And these are insectivorous. So they eat insects, and they have really, really, really big mouths. They have short legs, they have short bills, but they have large eyes because, again, as I mentioned earlier, their eyes are really important for them in terms of hunting and finding food. They have long wings, as you can see from that common nighthawk in the upper right, kind of very boomerang-like, because again, they're aerial insectivores. So they're very good at flying, and they can turn quickly, just like all the other aerial insectivores, like our swallows and our chimney swifts. They're very acrobatic, and they have forward-facing whiskers, not in the nighthawk family, but in the Caprimulginae family. They have these forward-facing whiskers, like you can see kind of on the whippoorwill right up there in the top left. You see those little whiskers, and the thought is that those help protect their eyes as they're foraging, because they forage differently than, say, the nighthawks, which are up in the sky high, whereas these guys, may be foraging like in a grassland or, in an open understory forest. So they don't want to get, hurt their eyes in any way. And it's also thought that they can help them filter food into their mouth as well. One thing I think is really cool about nightjars is they can actually undergo a form of daily torpor anywhere from 1.5 to 22 hours. And the common poorwill pictured here has actually been known to hibernate in the winter for hours or even weeks. That's pretty amazing for a bird and extremely rare. So I want to go a step further on this because there is a graduate student at the university. Well, he graduated now, but he is going to be publishing some papers soon, but he did some work at Sand Ridge, and they put transmitters on a bunch of whippoorwills, and they were able to track where these whippoorwills went. And they tracked them down to central Mexico. And what they found was when they went down there to try to see where the birds were, because they were really curious about what habitat these birds were in, and they went down to where they thought they should have been based on the transmitters, but they couldn't hear anything. They couldn't, the birds weren't calling at all. And what they're thinking now is that perhaps because it was cold where these birds were, because this is higher elevation areas, that they were actually hibernating possibly. That's kind of their current theory they have going. But I thought that was really interesting, and it'll be interesting to find out if that is in fact the case. Check-wills, widows, and eastern whippoorwills have semi-similar habitat. They both forage, in open areas. They both depend on mixed forests or these forests that are dry. They also, in terms of the whippoorwill, what they're finding is, historically we've thought they only use forest to forage in, or open understory forest, but they actually go out and they forage in these sand prairie areas, especially in Illinois. The areas where I've been where these birds are found, and I recorded them a long time ago, they're foraging in these open, oak savanna, sandy subsoil sand prairie areas. And so it's kind of interesting and it's neat, but they also still depend on the forest because that's where they're typically nesting. But so the two different habitat types seem like it could be critical for these bird species. These are the three that we monitor in Illinois. So we have whippoorwills, check-wills widow, which is on the threatened species list in Illinois, and then common nighthawks. We have found that our surveys aren't very good for detecting common nighthawks, and that's not too surprising, because if you're familiar with common nighthawks, then you know probably that a lot of the time when we see them these days, it's in towns or cities. And historically, while they nested in more natural areas, now they're using more rooftops to nest in. And while they will use like sand prairie areas to nest in, there's just not a lot of that type of habitat left. So it could be at some point that another survey is undertaken for nighthawks specifically, because again, we know they're declining, and as rooftops continue to change, it's just not suitable for them to nest on them as much anymore. I was interested in eBird data in terms of whippoorwills. And so I contacted eBird a while back, and I asked them for comparison data so that I could use it to compare with Moon data. So Moon started in 2008. And so I asked for eBird data from 2008 to 2018 at the time. And so they gave me the data, and I looked and pulled out the first 5 years, that 2008 to 2013. And then I separated it from the 2014 to 2018 eBird data. And what you can see here is all those purple dots on the map are the first 5 years, but all the aqua blue dots that you see, that's the second 5 years, or more recent years. And the main thing to note is that most of those aqua dots don't have purple dots on them underneath of them. So what this is showing you is that they're being found in fewer areas. And so again, we know they're declining, but eBird data also shows this as well. Here's some Moon data. So similarly, I pulled out some Moon data from the first 5 years of the study to the next 6 years of the study. And what you can see here is that it looks like our birds are declining. It starts off with barred owl, which we get, they're a species that again are common throughout the state. But the orange bar there is showing the most recent years. and whippoorwills, again, there appears to be a decline with them. The one that looks a little higher over on your right is the chuck-will's widow. That one, we have very, very few routes where chuck-will's widows are even detected. And so there is one route that goes through Forbes State Park in Illinois, and that's a park where active management has been taking place. They have a good fire regime that's been going on. And we know based on previous research that nightjars do respond well to a fire management plan. And so that could be why we're seeing that uptake in some of the chuck-will's widows. Here are all the routes where eastern whippoorwills have been detected. And you can see there's some spikes on there, but for the most part, very few routes get or detect whippoorwills, or if they do, very few whippoorwills, unfortunately. Here's another figure showing the average number of eastern whippoorwills per route. And over the course of the moon program so far, they appear to be declining. This is just one route I pulled out that at the beginning of moon, this is down in Jasper County. This route was actually run by Scott Simpson, who worked for the DNR and until he retired. But this route is relatively close to where he lived. And so he's run this route for a long time. And as you can see here, he's like, oh, the birds are just disappearing, they're not there. And so unfortunately, what's going on, we're not sure. Again, it could be, something to do with things that are happening along their migratory route. From what we know from the Ian Souza Coles, he's the graduate student that did the recent research with the whippoorwills here in Illinois and put the transmitters on, the places where these birds are stopping over are it's interesting. It's not necessarily the most suitable habitat. So you have to wonder how these birds are finding food, and it could be greatly affecting their survival. Here are chuck-will's widows detections per route over all years. And as I think I mentioned a while back, we have very few routes, as you can see, where chuck-will's widows have ever been detected. And that Marion County one where Forbes is that one that's had the most detections over time. And there's actually an Iowa route in there. So that IA one next to the bar on the far left is an Iowa route. So I had someone from the DNR contact me. He was now retired from the Iowa DNR a few years ago, interested in nightjar surveys because I guess they weren't looking at nightjars at all in Iowa and didn't have anything set up. And I said, sure, if you want to collect the data, we'll take it. And so he's been monitoring for pretty high quality habitat routes actually over there the past few years. And I know we've seen a few declines even on those routes as well. So it's unfortunate. I want to talk at least about one owl here, and that's the screech owl. So again, I've mentioned that, screech owls can be harder to detect. And I wanted to kind of show that with our data. So the blue line there shows no playback being used. So no use of anything, just passive listening for 6 minutes. That's the blue line. But the orange line is the incorporation of a playback. And this is, I should have said, this is during all the years that moon has been going on to this point. So that's using playback. So again, detection increases a little bit with that playback, with only the playback. But when you combine the two, the passive listening plus adding the playback in, detection definitely increases. So again, I think it is important to use playback for screech owls if you can. And then finally, I want to show this figure because, as I said, I've lost volunteers because they're bored on their routes because they don't hear anything. And so they don't necessarily want to do those routes again. But I try to tell them it's still good data. It's still important for us because we want to look at those routes and then say, well, is it because the habitat is poor quality habitat, or is it because they're just simply declining and there's, no food available for them, or they're declining across their migratory range? So what's going on? But again, the high bar there on the left, those are routes that have ever been monitored one time. Whereas you can go towards your right, and those are routes that have been monitored, more than just one time. So the far right is routes that have been monitored 10 times. So very few routes have actually been monitored during the course of the whole 10 years of, the first 10 years of the moon surveys. So I'd like this figure to look totally the opposite way. For 2022, the moon windows are going to be May 9th to the 22nd and June 7th to the 20th. I just had to throw that in there because if anybody's interested, please contact me. I'm always happy to have more volunteers. Now I'm going to switch to spring bird count. So I'm guessing many of you participate in the spring bird count, which is May 7th this coming year. And if you don't, it is a volunteer bird count, and it always falls between the Saturday between the 4th and 10th of May every year. It's statewide and it's broken up by county. And so the unique thing about this is that you can basically go anywhere in the county and count birds. And over time, what we've found is that, we have the same volunteers and they go to the same areas for the most part every year. And so from that aspect, it makes the data a bit more statistically strong. But again, that's an assumption that most volunteers are going to the same area. But what we have found is that because we have so much data at this point, we are able to look at trends over time and see what's happening with many species. We also ask that volunteers commit at least 8 hours for a county. Again, we want to have enough data and make the data useful. If you're not familiar with the history of the count, it kind of came from Chandler Robbins in a little bit of a way, even though Vern Kleen actually started the count in Illinois. He kind of got the idea from Chandler, who he worked with back in the day. Chandler actually tasked Vern with helping him start a spring bird count in Maryland. And then when Vern became the Illinois state ornithologist, the DNR tasked him with figuring out a way to try to figure out what's going on with birds in Illinois. And so Vern took what he'd learned from Chandler at the time, who started the Brady Bird Survey, and he took that information and started the Illinois Spring Bird Count with the help of the Illinois Audubon Society at the time. And it's been going pretty strong ever since. And that was back in 1972. And so this past year marked the 50th year of the Spring Bird Count. And we have been busy going through lots of historical bird count data of late, trying to go through and find errors and make sure that anything historical wise makes sense, and so that we can really get an idea of what's going on and make sure our data is I guess error-free as possible. And actually the years from 72 to 74 had never even been entered. They were still in hard copy. So those have now, they're mostly all entered at this point. So it'll be nice to have that data too. As I said, we use the data to determine population trends. We use it to look at range movement, to see if, I talked about earlier, they looked at National Audubon looked at over 300 bird species, and they've been able to show range movement in those species. We can also use SBC data for that. We can look at distribution, where birds are distributed throughout the state, because not every bird is found throughout the state of Illinois. And then also we can look at vagrant and rare bird species and document those. And then finally, the most important thing, contribute to conservation management decisions. Here's just a general figure that I throw into the count report every year, the most common species, because as we know, some common species are unfortunately declining. So it's important to watch these common species, because we have a lot of data on them. So if the common species are declining, then there's something going on. I put red-winged blackbird and Rotman because they continue to be the most common species in the state of Illinois. Some of the species that have declined, probably not a surprise here based on spring bird count data, are things like eastern meadowlark. This is a grassland dependent species. And so again, we've seen declines in this bird. Horned larks. This one's interesting. You know, I saw a lot last winter, but every year I struggle to find these. And I help out with Gallatin County for the spring bird count down in Southern Illinois. And every year I have a hard time finding a horned lark, which seems silly, but it's clearly declining. So maybe it's not so silly that I can't always find one. Common greckles. Again, it's as its namesake, it's supposed to be common, but again, we're seeing a decline in those birds. Osprey, I don't want to be totally negative. So here's some positive data. So osprey are increasing. You know, this is a bird that's on the endangered species list. And it seems every year we're seeing more of these during the spring bird count. And it's not just osprey, it's birds of prey in general. We're seeing, you know, eagles all over the state now. Red-tailed hawks have greatly increased. Kestrels, Cooper's hawks, you know, many of these birds of prey have really been doing well. But again, they were doing pretty poorly when the count started due to pesticide use. So they've made a comeback. So that's nice to see. Here's a red-eyed vireo. You know, this is one of the little birds that's increased in number, as has Acadian flycatcher. In terms of distribution, or I should say new species introduction, Eurasian tree sparrow was introduced in 1870 in St. Louis. And while you might think it would have spread throughout the state faster, it really hasn't. And that's primarily due to probably the house sparrow, which was the more aggressive of the two species, stopping it from making it more distributed throughout the state. So again, the first figure on your left is data from 1975 to 85 of the spring bird count data. And the data on the right, or the figure on the right, is showing data from 1986 to 2012. And if I were to show this data using more recent data, I would think we'd see even a little bit more distribution of this species in the state, because I know it's spread through some other counties. I know my parents have them up in Whiteside County, and they're at their bird feeders regularly up there now. So again, this bird is continuing to move, just at a slow pace. The house finch, which was introduced in the 1940s on the East Coast, continues to move its way westward. So, you know, the first 10 years of the count, it was just moving into Illinois. And then you see now, we all know house finches are all over at this point. Most of us have them at our bird feeders, I'm sure. Here's some examples of distribution. So here's a Vesper sparrow. The darker color is heavier distribution. Here's a white-eyed vireo. This one is a little more interesting to look at because we know they're found farther south than they are farther north in the state. But again, it's using spring bird count data, so we can look at things like this. I'm going to now switch into something that I think is really important. It's a program I mentioned earlier, the Critical Trends Assessment Program that I work for in Illinois. And this isn't a volunteer program, but I think it's a really important monitoring program. And the reason this program was started was because they published this big 1994 environmental report, and it was a 7-volume report, and it was back in 1994. And what they found was, with the decline in pollutants, they were still seeing big ecosystems degraded, and also they didn't have enough data to actually really understand at the time how ecosystems were doing. So the DNR tasked us at the survey to start a program where we could monitor wetlands, grasslands, and forests, as well as streams throughout the state of Illinois, and monitor the bird communities as well as the plant and insect communities. And as far as I know, at the time, we were the only state that had a program like this of its kind. And so it's a really unique program. And something else that makes this program really unique is that we have over 600 randomly selected sites throughout the state, and most of them are on private land. So we work with lots and lots of landowners, and the data that we collect is used for things like preservation, restoration, and management of habitats. We've had a lot of people use our data. If people ask us for it, we will happily supply that data to them. That's what we want the data to be used for. We want people to, be good land stewards and want to use our data for things like that. We monitor the same sites every 5 years. And so every year we do a subset of the sites. So we do 30 wetlands, 30 grasslands, and 30 forests. And the bird person goes out and the plant crew goes out, and the plant people also collect insect information, which we're still going through. But it's a really unique study, as I said, and we've been able to find lots of interesting things from the data. And here's an example of one of the ways we can use our data. So if you're looking at the first figure, these are white oaks throughout Illinois based on CTAP data. And you can see the canopy layer of, white oaks has primarily, stayed the same throughout the state. But if you're looking at the shrub layer using CTAP data, and I should have said this program started in 1997, so we have over 20 years of data at this point. The shrub oak layer is not doing well. And that's not a good thing, because if you know oaks, they're a keystone species. They're super important. They provide habitat, they provide food, they provide great leaf litter that so many organisms depend on. So it's not good if this is what's happening with the shrub layer, because at some point this canopy layer is just not going to be there anymore. We know oaks live a long time, but we need regeneration. And then we see things like garlic mustard and, Lonicera, honey, non-native honeysuckle coming in, and it's crowding out, these good native species. Again, we live in a very fragmented landscape. And when we use our CTAP data to look at forest across Illinois, in terms of birds, we see what we would expect to see. Larger forests yield larger number of bird species. And so these smaller fragmented forests are, they're not going to have the species diversity that larger patches or forest stands would. Also, we have some nice reference sites, some really high quality sites that we use to compare with our random sites. And so you can see in terms of bird species diversity, our reference sites by far have a lot more diversity over there on the right side of this figure. Also, in terms of grassland, this is using grassland data. You can see our grassland dependent bird species is also much higher in those reference sites too. I want to wrap up the CTAP information just by saying that anything we've done with this data, it falls under the umbrella of no regret strategies. So, when we do conservation, we want to make sure that anything we do is going to be beneficial versus harmful. We hope to acquire and protect more acres of land. We want to restore and reconstruct natural ecosystems, make sure that areas that are, have good hydrology, continue to have good hydrology, try to control and manage invasive species. And then finally, help manage streams and aerate them and keep them cool. With climate change, we're going to continue to see problems with this. And then I should say too, many of the landowners we work with, most of them, they'll ask, how do we be better land stewards? What can we do? And so, being able to help them, or at least give them, some information about what we've learned, I think is really important. And I really appreciate that they ask those questions too. Now I'm going to move into the last program I want to talk about, and that is the Midwest Migration Network. And this is a group of people that have come together to focus on the Midwest. It's multi-coordinated, bird monitoring groups that have kind of been lumped into 4 different groups. And it's mainly these groups were put together to address knowledge gaps in life cycles of birds. And so there's 4 big working groups. There's the banding and ground surveys group. There's a telemetry group, a radar and acoustics group, and then a Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition group. And this was really nice for me to learn about, because I've wanted to put together a migratory bird banding station for some time now. And so I thought, well, this will be great because then we have people to work with throughout the Midwest where we have standardized data that we collect, and the data will be more useful. So again, I just mentioned standardization. And so that's really important, that you can, look at the bigger picture versus just state by state basis. Also, understanding the importance of habitat composition is very important, especially for stopover habitat for migrating birds. And as I mentioned before, filling knowledge gaps in the life cycle of these birds is very important. If we find out birds that we have trapped are ending up, say down in Peru or whatnot, that's important information to have. So again, I think this is really important that this program is going on and that these different working groups have been put into place. Another component that is near and dear to me is education and outreach. And so this gives me an opportunity to have, groups out like this lovely 4th grade Girl Scout here, and do things like put a bird in their hand so that they understand that birds and other animals and plants are important. And, this is something I think that should just be fundamental, but it isn't always. And so teaching them that bird conservation is important, I think is critical, because if they have an appreciation for that, they're probably going to have an appreciation for most natural things. Also, we have mainly a lot of university students that help us out. I have over 30 volunteers, and many of them are graduate students and university staff. And so they may not always have that opportunity to gain experience, but because of this program, they can gain experience and take that on and hopefully have a better chance of finding a job somewhere else and, have more field experience. And then finally, conservation organizations, it's great to have people out that care about what we do. And, especially, if these are organizations that work really hard, it's nice for them to be able to hold a bird and, hold the thing that they really do a lot of work for. Our banding station is in East Urbana. And I started this actually in 2019. And so we band in the fall and the spring because it's migratory birds that we're trying to catch. And the neat thing about where we're set up is this is a university owned site. And so, it's not necessarily open to the public unless we bring them in. And what's also nice about it is it's still kind of early successional. So the university acquired this site, which was mostly egg in 1970. And so we have this shrub layer still in the forested area that birds definitely use. There's old field areas. There's some restored prairie. And there's also the saline branch of the Salt Fork River that runs through here. So there's a water source. So, to a migrating bird that's flying over an agriculturally dominated landscape, this may look somewhat favorable. In addition to processing the birds, we also collect a daily list of anything we see or hear and do point counts. This just strengthens the data that we collect and makes it a little more statistically powerful. We band the birds, we take an age, and we determine sex if we can. We take a fat and muscle score, and then finally wing, tail, tarsus, and mass measurements. To date, we have banded 1,620 birds. As I said, we started in the fall of 2019, and I should say we only band once a week. So we've done pretty well so far for only banding once a week during the migratory bird banding season. We've banded about 72 species, our top being Swainson's thrush and ovenbirds. We do get quite a few of those. We have had many species of warblers. I know it's over 15 or 16 species that we've had out there. So seem to get a diverse group of birds out there. And in terms of effort, we were shut down in the spring of 2020, right after we started in the fall. So we've only really had one spring banding under our belt. But if we were to just look from the data we have so far, it would seem that fall is the season that we're going to have our higher numbers of birds coming through. And something else that I did expect based on the habitat that we're working with is we do get more young birds that we're capturing versus adult birds. Again, this isn't a huge area. So, I don't necessarily expect a lot of, more experienced birds to use the area. Whereas we do get a lot of these young birds coming in. Here's just some pretty birds to look at. I love fox sparrows. So I get excited because we seem to catch quite a few at our banding station. So it's nice seeing those. And we do get some hummingbirds, even though we don't ban those, but they're still fun to get out of the nets. And then with that, I just want to thank all the people that make what we do happen, especially the volunteers, because again, most of these programs are volunteer based, and without volunteers, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So thank you. And there's a little sow that we captured last year for you to look at as I end. And I will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
One of the first comments that came in was talking about a powerful memory of Camp Tapawango in Metamora, Illinois in the 1960s was the calling of the whippoorwills. And the person said, I do not see that Tazewell County and Woodford County found these birds. So the question is, are they gone, or is this just not a site that is monitored? That would be Tazewell County and Woodford County.
Well, that's a good question. So Tazewell, we don't have anybody monitoring in Tazewell right now. That's not to say they're not there. Like I said, we don't have coverage everywhere in terms of where our moon routes are, but they have greatly declined throughout the state. We know this. They've greatly declined throughout North America. Everybody's finding the same findings, and you're right in that we're just not hearing them anymore. And to tell you the truth, they probably aren't in most areas. I do think they are found in the state, and probably some of these areas that you may be thinking of. It's just there's not as many of them. And so in terms of detection, it's just harder to find them. We get a lot of phone calls still to this day, like, where are my whippoorwills? Why aren't I hearing my whippoorwills? What can I do to get my whippoorwills back? And it's a hard question to answer, because you can manage your land perfectly for whippoorwills, but whether or not they're going to be around to use it is the hard part. But I always tell people, still go ahead and manage, because guaranteed, if you're managing for whippoorwills, that's going to be beneficial to many other species of birds. So yes, it's pretty depressing on the whippoorwill front right now. So
another person asked, what website can we look at to find some of this information, such as these bird counts and the surveys? I suppose specifically the spring bird counts.
Okay, yep. So if you just Google INHS spring bird count, like the Illinois Natural History Survey spring bird count, you'll be able to get to the spring bird count website. No problem. We are working on, we're going to revamp that actually. So the survey's been revamping a lot of their websites, but we're going to revamp the spring bird count one, because we're actually working with all the data right now. And Mike Ward, who I work with on the spring bird count, he's a statistical wizard, and he's wrote some great code that we're hoping to be able to use to make the database really user friendly, so that if volunteers want to go on and say make a quick distribution map, that they should be able to do that through the spring bird count website, or just get a general trends list for the county that they may count in. That'll be easy to do too. So that's kind of our future plans, and we're going to work with Audubon some on that too. So the hope is that that's available soon too. But if you're just interested on the volunteer aspect right now at this point, yes, you can definitely find the website if you just Google INHS spring bird count, or you can contact me and I can just send you the website too. So.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions? You're free to unmute yourself and ask Tara directly.
Let's see, let me end my
I just have a comment, not a question. So I've done the moon survey once, and it is my recommendation would be to do it with a friend or a buddy. Because especially if you're not seeing any or hearing any nightjars or owls, at least you have some company.
And I'll totally agree with Pete on that. And it's one thing I'm glad you brought up, Pete, because I always tell people that I talk to about it, do it with someone else. And it's a safety thing. I mean, you're out at night too. Like I always do it with someone too, because again, it's nice to have someone to talk to and not be alone out there. So that's a really good point. Thank you, Pete.
Words of wisdom.
Yes.
Any other questions? No, some comments are coming in that everyone is very appreciative of this very, very interesting presentation. And we thank you very much. So on behalf of Peoria Audubon Society, we thank you immensely for taking the time to come and speak with us about your very interesting avian research projects and the overall state of how everyone can help.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, thank you.